Hello, my name is Dr. Teresa Bacon-Bagley. I'm a professor in the College of Health Professions at Grand Valley State University. Today, we're going to look at a map of the human brain. And more specifically, we're going to look at the structure and functional relationship of the brain. By the end of this module, you'll be able to understand that each part of the brain has a very specific function. The goal of this module is to describe the gross structure and function of the different parts of the brain. We're going to be looking at the lobes of the brain, which are the frontal lobe, the parietal lobe, temporal lobe, occipital lobe. We'll look at the brainstem. We're going to be looking at structures that are inside of the brain, deep in the brain, such as the pituitary gland, as well as the hypothalamus. Now, some interesting facts about the brain. The brain weighs about 1,300 to 1,400 grams. It's made up of about 100 billion neurons. That's a lot of neurons. Neurons are cells that have the ability to communicate with each other. We're going to have another module that actually looks at those types of cells. The Society for Neuroscience has said that the brain is the most complex living structure on the universe. Although we know a lot about the brain at this time, there still is a lot we do not know. Now, the brain is situated inside the skull. The skull is that bony structure. The skull is very important as it protects the brain from impact. As we look underneath the skull, we find that there's a layer of fluid that the brain is bathed in. This fluid is called cerebral spinal fluid. The brain by itself has a consistency of like gelatin. The brain actually floats inside the skull, bathed in that fluid that's called cerebral spinal fluid. This isn't a lot of fluid, it's just a teaspoon or more of fluid that's within the cerebral spinal fluid space in the brain, but it does absorb shock, which protects the brain from hitting the skull and causing damage to the brain tissue. Now, the layers that are between the brain and the skull are referred to as the meninges. So the brain is not only protected by the skull, it is also covered by these three layers of tissues called the meninges. These three layers are the dura mater, the arachnoid, and the pia mater. The thickest, most outermost layer is the dura. It's almost like a thin sheet of leather. Those three layers protect the brain and keep the cerebral spinal fluid within those layers so that it doesn't leak out. When you look at the entire brain, it is made of two main parts, a right and a left cerebral hemisphere. Now, those two parts of the brain are mirror images of each other, and they're connected to each other through some neuron fibers called the corpus callosum. The structure of the brain is associated with very specific functions of the body. Each one of these hemispheres has specialized areas which are responsible for motor or movement of the muscles. There are some areas that are important for the ability to interpret sensations such as touch, hot, cold. And there are some parts of the brain that are very specific for thinking, especially thinking regarding problem solving, the ability to add 2 plus 2, the ability to make a decision based on multiple facts. And there's other parts of the brain that are specifically for the ability to see things. Now we're going to look first at some of these lobes of the brain. There's the frontal lobe, which is right in the forehead space. There are parts of that frontal lobe that are important for motor movement. That part is referred to as the motor cortex, which you can see is identified in this picture. There's other parts of the frontal lobe that are important for our ability to speak or for speech, which you can see identified in this picture. We refer to this speech area as Broca's area. If an individual had damage to this area of the brain, then they would have difficulty in speaking, putting words together. This is seen frequently in individuals that have had strokes. There's other parts of the frontal lobe that are important for cognitive skills. These are knowledge skills, the ability to problem solve, think, plan something out. And that's the frontal association area. That's really right in your forehead. Damage to that area makes it very difficult to solve problems, to concentrate, to organize an event. Just behind the frontal lobe is the parietal lobe. It's shown here in yellow. Now, the parietal lobe also has areas that have specific function. The somatosensory cortex is very important for the ability to interpret sensation from the body. In other words, pain, temperature, touch, vibration, all that information is interpreted way up in that area. You also have an area in the parietal lobe that's very important for speech. Not articulation, but more the ability to understand what other people are saying or to understand what you actually read. So language is interpreted within that parietal lobe, and the area is identified as both speech and reading. The occipital lobe, way in the back part of the brain, is important for vision. It's important for us to be able to see colors, to be able to see shapes, and then also to interpret those shapes. The temporal lobe is very important for hearing. Hearing is referred to as auditory sensation. Our temporal lobe is also very important for short-term memory. I like to say the short-term memory, such as looking up a telephone number in the internet or in a telephone book and memorizing that in time to get to the phone and then punch that number in. So if one were to have damage to your temporal lobe, you may have problems with short-term memory. These two links on the left side of this slide are great links in that they both are somewhat tutorial in understanding the areas of the brain, their structure, and then their functional relationship. Now, we talked about the lobes of the brain and some of their function. There are some other parts of the brain that are referred to as association areas. For example, in the occipital lobe, we have two areas. We have our visual cortex, which is very important for identifying colors and shapes. Then we have this visual association area. The visual association area is very important because it gives meaning to what we see. I'd like to give you an example of that. When you're driving down the road and you see this sign, this metal shape that's along the side of the road, and it's red, and it has these letters STOP in the sign. Our visual cortex identifies the sign, identifies the color, identifies the shape, but it's our visual association area that gives it meaning, that allows us to understand that that sign means that we must stop the car, that we must halt what we're doing. So within each part of the brain, each lobe has association areas that give things meaning. Let me give you another example of an association area. So look at the temporal lobe where we have the auditory cortex, that part of the brain that interprets what we hear. So the auditory cortex determines loudness, softness, the pitch of what we hear, but the association area gives it meaning. An example of this is a baby that cries. Now, mothers that have children, that have babies, are able to distinguish a cry that means that there's danger versus a cry that's a whine. So that association area is what gives that cry of the baby some meaning. You can see that there are other association areas in the parietal lobe for other sensations. There are association areas within the motor cortex that's in the frontal lobe. And that association area to motor allows us to coordinate movements. A good example of this is a gymnast. A gymnast has to have quick responses. They do flips, they do jumps, they balance on one foot, then another foot. Now, in order to coordinate all those activities, you need those motor association areas to work well. And if you have damage to any association area, you can have problems with interpretation of either motor or sensory input. Now, as we mentioned before, each part of the brain has a specific function. Now, in this diagram here, we're looking at the sensory and motor strips of the brain. Sometimes I call those the sensory cortex and the motor cortex. It's the same thing as the strips. In this diagram, you can see in the frontal region that they've sliced through the motor cortex, and you can see in that motor cortex down below that each part of the motor cortex represents a very specific part of the body. You can see that the hand is represented in the motor cortex in a very specific place. Well, that part of the motor cortex actually controls our hand movements. If you look at the face on the motor cortex, the muscles that are involved for smiling, for chewing, all those muscles receive information from that specific part of the motor cortex. We call this topographically oriented. In other words, each part of that motor strip has or is responsible for a very specific part of the body. The same thing occurs for the somatosensory cortex or the sensory strip. You can see as identified in the blue portion of the brain, you can see that the somatosensory cortex is also topographically oriented. In other words, each part of that sensory strip is responsible for sensing a specific part of the body. I'm going to target the hand again. You can see on the sensory strip that there's an area where the hand lies. That's the part of the somatosensory cortex that is able to determine if our hands touch something hot or cold, or whether we have pain in the hand. Now we're going to look at the structure of the brain as if we separated the two cerebral hemispheres. One way of describing this view is a cross-sectional view. So we're separating in this slide the two cerebral hemispheres and looking at the structures from inside the brain. What you can notice in this picture is the corpus callosum. That's the area where the fibers would be connecting these two cerebral hemispheres. As you can see in this picture also, there's the hypothalamus, the pituitary gland, which we'll talk about in subsequent slides. This is another cross-section of the brain where we're looking deep inside the structures. Again, this is just as if you separated the two cerebral hemispheres and looking deeper in the brain. We're going to first look at the outer portion of the brain. The cerebral cortex, that's the outer portion. That's what we talked a little bit about with the lobes of the brain. The cerebral cortex is within the lobes of those brain. The cerebral cortex really is important for function as well as sensory. We also, in those association areas, store our memory as far as what we see, what we feel, sharp, dull, hot, cold. So our cortex is very important. We have a lot of long-term memory issues there. The corpus callosum, which is identified here, are the fibers that connect the two hemispheres, the right and the left. And now we're going to look a little deeper in the brain. The pituitary gland, which looks like this ball on a stalk. The pituitary gland produces a lot of hormones. It produces hormones that control growth. Our growth hormone comes from the pituitary gland. Growth hormone is very important for children for growth of their height. There also are hormones in the pituitary gland that involve sexual development. In females, the hormones that are responsible for menstruation come from the pituitary gland. There are hormones from the pituitary gland in males that allow them to produce testosterone. There are also hormones in the pituitary gland that control our metabolism, such as thyroid hormone, which helps our cells function at a normal rate. Damage to the pituitary gland can cause multiple problems based on deficiencies of those hormones. The hypothalamus is above the pituitary gland, and the hypothalamus is a region of the brain that controls a number of things. It actually controls our body temperature. There's a thermostat that's up in our hypothalamus that tries to keep our body at 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit. If we have damage to that area of the brain, we have a problem with keeping our temperature within that normal range. There are also neurons in that brain that play a role in osmoregulation. Now you're probably wondering, what is osmoregulation? It's really our water balance. So there's areas within the hypothalamus that identifies when we need to be drinking more water, and therefore we get thirsty and then we drink water. Also, the hypothalamus contains hormones that help to control the pituitary hormones. So there's an interaction between the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland. The other structures in this cross-section of the brain that we're going to briefly discuss are structures that are within the brainstem. The brainstem is the lower portion of the brain. It is made up of the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla, and also talk about the cerebellum. Now, the cerebellum also plays a role in fine motor control as well as posture and balance. Injury to this part of the brain results in individuals having poor balance as well as having an uncoordinated type of motor activity. They're able to walk, they're able to contract muscles, but they do it in an uncoordinated way, and they actually look like they walk with kind of a stagger. Now moving on to the brainstem, the pons, which is the middle portion of the brainstem, really contains a lot of the neuron fibers that connects the spinal cord with the cerebellum so that we have coordination between the motor cortex, the cerebellum, and the muscles. There's also fibers that go from the motor cortex all the way down to the spine that go through this area. The medulla oblongata is a very important portion of the brainstem because it controls breathing. It also plays a big role in controlling our heart rate and blood pressure. Damage to this area results in the inability to breathe, as well as difficulty with controlling your cardiovascular system. There's also some reflexes that occur that are important within that area, such as vomiting as well as sneezing. The midbrain, the upper portion of the brainstem has areas in it that help us with our vision and help us with our auditory system. There's also areas in the midbrain that are important with movement, such as an area called the substantia nigra. The substantia nigra is that portion of the brain that is destroyed in individuals that have Parkinson's. And individuals that have Parkinson's tend to have some tremors. Their hands shake, their head shakes. So the midbrain has regions in it that also contribute to body movement. As you can see from this description in the cross-section of the brain, there's quite a few areas that play a role in our muscle movement. We have our motor cortex, we have the association of the motor cortex, we have the cerebellum, we have the midbrain structures, we have some pons structures, and we also have information from our muscles that contributes to our body movement. So this goes way back to one of those first slides that says, man, our brain is a very complex system. These are some very interesting links that have to do with the brain. There's a link on neuroethics, a link for neuroscience for kids, and I actually find this fun to do. It's actually a kind of an online tutorial on identifying structures in the brain, the cell components in the brain, etc. There's a BBC, which I'm going to show in a few minutes. It's just a 2-minute clip introduction to a series of videos on the structure function of the brain. And then there's the TED Talk, which is a talk by a neurosurgeon from Harvard University who actually talks about creativity in the brain. And this is the end of the module on the map of the human brain, which is the structure and functional relationships of the brain.